Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 6th, 2025. And I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. It's a new year, and we've got a new season for you, starting out strong with an incredible individual that we're really, really honored to have had the opportunity to chat with. But before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible as we enter into our 11th year. What? Yeah, we started this show in 2014. Today, this is episode 533. And the patrons, I just can't thank you enough. Obviously, this show is free. Nobody pays for it. Nobody has to pay for it. You can just download it through any app that you want to listen to. So those of you who take the time and have the financial capability to support the show the way that you do, I'm just so incredibly grateful. You don't have to do it. You do it out of the goodness of your heart, and you make it so that we can keep this thing going. You help me by paying both my incredible producer and assistant, Noelle Dilworth, and also the editing company that I work with, and also help me, carve out the time in my really busy schedule, because I am now working as a psychology fellow, soon to be, hopefully, fingers crossed, fully licensed psychologist. And so, yeah, I'd like to be able to keep doing this, and you make it possible. So thank you for that. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, so let's get into it. I had the opportunity to speak with a giant in her field. Dr. Judith L. Herman is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She's also the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and she's a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. You may have read, if you are a student of psychology or psychiatry and you've done any sort of specialization in trauma or PTSD, you've likely read her just incredibly important book, Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. But she now has a new book out. It's called Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Judith L. Herman. Well, Judith, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
And thanks for braving all of our tech issues. I'm glad we worked it out, because I'm so excited to talk to you about your new book, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. And my podcast, I am a psychologist, but my podcast didn't start as a psychology podcast, and I only really cover these topics periodically. So many listeners maybe didn't study psychology or psychiatry, and they may not know that you are the expert on trauma. I mean, you wrote the book that every student reads, Trauma and Recovery. And so it really is a boon to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I'd love to talk a little bit first about the transition. Kind of what was it that brought you to want to write the new book? Did you feel like there was more research? Did you feel like there were just things that you really hadn't been able to say back when you first wrote Trauma and Recovery? What made you say, okay, I have a whole new volume here?
Well, actually, the book was kind of a long time sitting on the back shelf. I first started working on it around 2000, which was just, maybe 10 years after Trauma and Recovery. And I think the unfinished business, if you will, in Trauma and Recovery was that I had argued in that book that trauma isn't just a personal psychological problem. It's a social and political problem.
Mm-hmm.
And because the violence, the interpersonal violence that causes trauma is a crime, or at least nominally a crime. And that's not just an individual matter. That's a matter for the whole society to deal with.
Yeah.
So, but then the stages of recovery that I outlined in that book were about individual healing, starting with safety in the present and then doing the work of processing the trauma and integrating the trauma story into a life narrative so that it's not the whole story of one's life. It's one of the chapters in one's life story.
Yeah.
And then kind of refocusing on the present and future from a more proactive stance in the third stage of recovery. But that left unresolved the matter of social justice. And so the question was, would there be a final stage of recovery that involves seeking justice? And so what I did was I went back to the experts who are the survivors, and I interviewed 30 survivors of gender violence, 26 women and 4 men. And I asked them, if you could write the script, if you could have everything come out your way, what would make things right for you, or as right as possible? And so the new book is about what they told me. And you would think it would be an obvious question to ask, but in fact, nobody had ever bothered to ask it. So, and I chose gender violence because it's what I know best in terms of the patients I've worked with all my life, and B, it's the most common human rights violation in the world, according to the United Nations. But I would argue that the same principles could be applied to any situation where the dominance of one group over another is deeply embedded in the culture, whether that's dominance based on race or gender or religion or caste or social class, because, when the society basically accepts and normalizes and rationalizes and excuses the violence of the dominant group, which is the ultimate tool to keep the subordinate group subordinate, then you can't have justice.
So much comes up for me as you mentioned this, the way that this structure is recapitulated so often in any sort of dominant group. And we see this when we look at sort of models of racial identity development or different models within the psychology literature of sort of that last stage being a movement towards social justice, a movement towards civil action and collective action. That very often that is kind of the maybe like Maslow might have even, if he was thinking along these terms, called that sort of a self-actualization. But I really want to take a moment to just focus on the point that you made at the very end there, which is the normalization, especially of gendered violence, that is so pernicious and so ubiquitous as to not even seem present to many people. That often we talk about, let's say, mass shootings, and we forget to talk about the fact that the number one predictor is gender. But
Exactly.
we so assumed that the mass shooter is male that we just move right past that.
Right. Yeah. Because the acceptance of male violence as a sort of just a masculine trait, a normalized masculine trait, basically, is so widespread. It's not even really conscious. It's just that's the way things are.
Right. And sadly, there's nothing essentialist about maleness. There's nothing fundamental about being a man that means a man must be violent. This is
No.
because the culture reinforces it.
Yeah. I mean, my mother was a psychologist, both a researcher and a psychoanalyst. Her name was Helen Block Lewis, and she wrote a book about called Psychic War in Men and Women, and she talked about how basically the affectionate bonding of children to parents happens with both sexes. But that the socialization that we impose on kids requires men to be disposable warriors and women to be inferior childbearers. And it creates insoluble moral conflicts for both sexes, because if men are supposed to be aggressive, but that violates their affectionate nature, that creates guilt, which is, and men are more prone to guilt than shame. And for women, having their affectionate nature be considered a trait of inferiority creates shame, and women are more shame prone than men.
And more towards guilt and women more towards shame. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You know, there's this great documentary that I've cited a million times on the podcast so far called The Mask You Live In by Jennifer Siebel Newsom that talks about young boys and how we collectively influence young boys and, you know, as they develop, what that translates to in manhood. And one of the big takeaways is that as a culture, we have feminized every emotion other than anger or violence, right?
Exactly.
And feminizing it, we have made it less than, or we have made something that men do not want to be associated with. And then therefore they're constantly having to perform their masculinity, posture to each other. And sadly, you know, it may be the case that sometimes overtly violent acts are posturing and they are performative, but very often it's likely that these violent acts are a function of not having any other tools, right? Like, why do men so often commit violent acts?
Well, and also to impress other men.
Right.
I mean, there's one of the people I interviewed for the book. This is a psychologist at Northwestern who ran a preventive education program for the young men in college. was called Mars, which stood for masculinity, allyship, and something. And he had this exercise that he called the man box. And he had the guys, he would write on the blackboard all the words that they associated with masculinity, being a real man. And he said, the words were always the same. Eats red meat, drinks lots of beer, has sex with lots of women, tough, aggressive, stoical, never shows fear, and he said the word loving was never mentioned. And then he would put on the board, with chalk, he'd draw a box around these words, which he called the man box. And then he said, what happens if you step outside the man box? What words do you associate with that? And those words were also always the same: bitch, pussy, wimp. And so then he would say, well, I guess we're boxed in here, aren't we?
Yeah.
And he said the guys really could relate to it. They also needed emotional literacy. They didn't know how to name emotions. If you asked them how they were what they were feeling, they would say, okay.
Yeah, I see that a lot in therapy. It's either fine or it's tired or it's hungry, but it's very complex. Like I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm feeling melancholy or I'm feeling anxious or on edge. Like that's rare.
Yeah. But he said, they would train peer educators. And then the peer educators would go and do programs with sports teams and frats, and the guys would listen. Yeah, because it ended up giving them a sense that they too had a stake in gender equality.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know how many people, if it's really made explicit, want to have these struggles. I think for a lot of people, it's just so implicit as to not even recognize that it is a struggle. And I would point for the listeners to a brilliant older book. So, even the way it's written has its problems with like gendered language. But Aaron Beck's Prisoners of Hate. And I myself, I'm not like a very CBT oriented, a cognitive behaviorally oriented practitioner. I'm very, very existential, but I think that there is a lot of good in those kinds of writings about how we get to this place. But of course, that's not so much what you focus on. It's not the violence perpetrated by these men. It's the victimization of that violence and how a person who has experienced, whether it be a genocide, a rape, a trauma, a political terror, or a domestic assault, or any form of gendered violence and beyond, what do we do with that? How do we, I guess, foster resilience? How do we live a life after we've been victimized by somebody in a way that makes life feel like it may not be worth living?
Well, the consequences of trauma are shame and isolation. And the healing involves empowerment and connection with other people. And that's why the justice issue turns out to be so dependent on the actions of the bystanders. What I heard from the people I interviewed was that they didn't care that much about perpetrators. They weren't terribly focused on punishment. They also were not focused on forgiveness. They wanted acknowledgement, apology, and amends. And they wanted them from the bystanders even more than they wanted them from the perpetrators.
It makes so much sense. I mean, and it's just not reinforced in our media narrative, right? When we watch films, even when we watch television coverage of active trials, so much of the narrative is about retribution or about admonition or about, getting the perpetrator their due. That's always such a heavy, heavy theme. But you're right. When I actually dig in and I hear these stories, we saw a lot during the Me Too movement, the empowerment was when the individuals stood up and read their victim statements, when they got together, when they felt like people cared about them and that their voices were heard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, our justice system, which is a retributive justice system, is all about the perpetrator.
Yep.
The victim is simply a witness. The victim has no standing, basically, in court, other than as a witness. And I sometimes say that if one wanted to actually intentionally design a venue that would be guaranteed to aggravate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, mm-hmm. a criminal court would be ideal.
Right. It's not some sort of it is a passive, outcome, but it feels almost intentional, right? That that the way that these court proceedings are really deeply re-traumatize individuals and very often put the blame at the feet of the individuals. Like that's what the defense strategy is very often, is to figure out how to make the jury think that she was asking for it.
Well, right, because, it's an adversarial system where blaming the victim is, the sort of default strategy for the defense. It's interesting. I once took a course at the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting from a well-known forensic psychiatrist on how to be an expert witness in court. Mm-hmm. And the very first slide he put up at the beginning of the day was a picture of the Hatfields and the McCoys, mm-hmm. these fierce-looking mountain men with their rifles across their knees. And he said, "Why do we have courts? You may think we have courts to mete out justice or to determine the truth." He said, "Actually, the real reason we have courts is to resolve disputes without firearms." Mm. He said, "But short of physical attack, any sort of hostile encounter, any sort of hostile attack is allowed." And so he was preparing us as expert witness, as expert witnesses. He said, you better be prepared to be shamed and humiliated and have your credibility and your credentials and and if attacked, and if you have any skeletons in your closet, forget it, because they'll dig them out, and that's with all the privileges that we had coming in as expert witnesses, as professionals.
Yeah.
So can you imagine what a rape victim or an incest victim is going to go through?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. As somebody who's afraid of retaliation, potentially afraid of men in, powerful authoritarian positions, who doesn't understand the court system. Now you add a layer of maybe somebody doesn't have an education, or maybe English is not somebody's first language,
Oh,
or maybe they don't have the financial support or any social support. It's no wonder that for many, many women and trans men and gender minorities, they just don't report. They just would rather stay silent than open the whole can of worms. And that is a sad.
No, I mean, maybe 20% of rapes get reported. No, your odds of getting away with it are pretty much 95+%. One of the male survivors I interviewed is a man named Ross Chait, who has a law degree and is a professor at Brown. And he's one of the people who had delayed recall of childhood abuse. He'd been abused by the choir director in a boys' choir when he was a kid. And when he recovered the memories in later life, he reached out to other, alumni of the choir. And sure enough, the guy had been a serial perpetrator. Yeah. And they actually did file a criminal complaint, but it was too late for that because the statute of limitations had run. So they filed a civil complaint, both against the perpetrator and against the San Francisco Boys Choir. And the perpetrator defaulted. He left the state. Mm-hmm. The choir ultimately came to a negotiated settlement. But he said that when he got the first response from the choir's attorneys, they wanted, they just offered money in a non-disclosure agreement.
Right. Yeah.
And he said, no way. We wanted admission and an apology to all the victims, and we want all the victims notified. And they couldn't make sense out of the fact that the most important thing to him was the public acknowledgement. But he said when they first came back and, basically saying something like, if you were harmed,
mm-hmm.
We regret if you were harmed. What do you mean if? Mm-hmm. He said, his wife said, she thought the fact that he was a white, educated man with a law degree who was prepared to play hardball was, what ended up getting, he got the settlement he wanted. But that's a very rare.
Yeah, I'm sure that had something to do with it. And it's amazing that they wouldn't understand. It's not just about public acknowledgement. Yes, the public acknowledgement matters for the person who's harmed, but public acknowledgement is the first step of change. You can't change something if you can't admit that it even happened. And so if an organization can stand up and say, we regret that this happened. We were unaware of it at the time, but that means that we did not have policies in place that protected our youth. And we are changing our ways to ensure.
That's exactly right.
We need that.
Yes, actually. Well, and not only acknowledgement of facts, but acknowledgement of harm and acknowledgement that it was wrong.
Right. Right.
Because, I mean, otherwise it's just, oh, well, it's over. Why don't we just let bygones be bygones,
That's why this still happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Get over it.
And you mentioned something earlier that I think bears repeating, which is that the bystanders have a role here and they need to be called to task. We think about the Weinstein situations. We think about these kind of high profile cases where it's like, how could this have happened to so many people? Because there's a culture of silence, of looking the other way, of allowing it to happen.
Totally. You have the enablers, the people who are actually complicit, and then you have all the people who say, well, it's none of my business and, it's a private matter. I don't want to get involved. And that hurt for the survivors. That betrayal often hurts worse than the actual cruelty of the perpetrator.
Oh, absolutely. Because very often these bystanders, it's almost a misnomer to call them bystanders because very often they're people in positions of inordinate power that if they had just said something one time.
Right.
The whole, house of cards would have come down.
Yeah.
And how devastating to think about the experiences of so many individuals where there was systematic abuse.
Yeah.
Over, an entire childhood or an entire lifetime or an entire working relationship. I saw the devastating consequences of this so often when I worked in the foster care system.
Oh, yeah.
To the extent that these girls, I worked specifically with girls that were between the ages of 13 and 18. These were girls living in group homes that were very likely not going to get adopted. So they were going to age out of the system. Many of them were dual diagnosis. So they had mental health issues and substance use issues.
Of course.
They were obviously, the majority of them were victims. I always assumed a sexual violence instead of assuming no sexual violence. It was like assume it until proven otherwise. But very often I would see that these young girls were actively being trafficked and did not even have the language. In their view, it was their choice. This was somebody that was, helping them and taking care of them. And sometimes I love them and I'm not a victim. This is helping me get by. And and
the pimps know exactly how to spot
the
abused kids, and that's how they recruit them.
Yep.
And the data on that matter are, abused kids are 2 to 4 times as likely to be re-victimized as teens or adults, either with sexual assault, sex trafficking, domestic violence, sexual harassment. I mean, it's like they have a big fat target on their backs.
And I'm very lucky that I live in a very progressive state. I live in California. The laws are more progressive here than in most states. We do see big changes even within the LAPD working towards identifying these children as victims. But there are still places right now in this country that will call a 15-year-old trafficked victim a prostitute.
I know. One of the other people I interviewed for the book was this amazing judge in New York named Fernando Camacho, and he said he had organized a diversion court for trafficked kids because he got tired of seeing the same kids in his court.
Yeah.
Over and over and over being brought in, and sentenced to, either the pimp would bail them out or they would be sentenced to, 30 days in jail. And he realized, wait a minute, these kids are the same age as my teenage daughter.
Yeah.
And so he set up this diversion court. And it's become a model for the country now, where basically he's all in favor of the Nordic model where the pimps and the Johns should be criminalized, but not the people who are being prostituted.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and we do see this. We see these kinds of changes at the level of our justice system, but it moves very, very slowly. And it takes doing exactly what you have done as a researcher and as a clinician, which is talking to the very people who have experienced it themselves, asking them, when did you feel like you weren't being heard? When did you feel like you were being re-traumatized? When did you feel like you were being re-victimized? What changes can we make to protect you better?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is a means of empowerment, is giving back, protecting others, giving back to the system to make it stronger. I can't think of a more satisfying point of, let's call it post-traumatic growth, than being able to change the very system to help protect more people in the future.
Well, and it's interesting because among the 30 people I interviewed were actually 6 who did not only report the crimes, but went through the whole criminal justice ordeal to conviction and sentencing of the perpetrator. And they said the reason they did it was because one woman said, if I knew he'd done this to other people.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't live with myself if I found out he did it again, because I was too afraid to face him in court. And so then that, because, it was no fun, but they basically said, if I can prevent this from happening to one other person, then it won't have been in vain.
Absolutely. I hate to do this because we're we're out of time. I feel like I could talk to you for so much longer.
Well, alas, it's a big subject.
It is, but I'm so glad that you spent, your time with us today. It's a real honor to sit and chat with you. I hope that we can maybe reconnect sometime in the future to dig a little bit deeper. But I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice by Dr. Judith Herman. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.